Alright, this is the first of my video lecture recaps. Let's hope this goes well. So, right now, I'm going to be recapping the topic of week 3, which is light. What is light? That's kind of a, it seems obvious, but that's just because we take light for granted. To try and describe what it is kind of tricky. Well, here's what light is. You may have heard of an electromagnet, where it's like something that isn't a magnet, but then you run electricity through it, and it becomes a magnet. That's an example of how an electric field can induce a magnetic field. The reverse is also true. Magnetic fields can induce electric fields. This is how many turbine generators work. They use steam or a water source or something like that to spin a big magnet around a coil of wire, and the magnet moving creates a current. That's an example of a magnetic field inducing an electric field. Light is where you have a little electric field which induces a little magnetic field, which induces an electric field, which induces a little magnetic field, and so on and so on. An electric field and a magnetic field inducing each other forever, basically. So, when you really get down to it, that's what light is. Now, another thing that you may have heard is light a wave or a particle? Well, it's both. So light does have wave qualities. It can diffract like a wave. You don't need to worry about what diffraction is, but it's a quality of waves. Light has a wavelength and a frequency like other waves. So in that sense, light acts very much like a wave. However, light can also very meaningfully and accurately be described as a particle called a photon. A photon is especially useful in that it can be thought of as the smallest possible unit of light. You can't have less light than one photon. The photons, even though they're a particle, can also be described as having wavelength and frequency and such. So, it's a little weird, it's a little tricky, but light's weird like that. So, that pretty well covers, I believe, what light is. So, here's another question. What is color? What is color? Color is the wavelength of light. Specifically, more accurately, you might say that color is how our brains interpret the differences between different wavelengths of light. So, the classic kind of way to remember the colors of like a rainbow is Roy G. Biv. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet. Now, this is very useful for understanding light in a sort of physics sense, because this corresponds to the wavelengths of light. Red has the longest wavelength of the visible light, and violet has the shortest wavelength. And they all exist along this spectrum. So green and yellow are in the middle, blue's more on the short side, but not as short as violet, etc. Now, I almost said that red had a low wavelength and violet had a high wavelength. I stopped myself, because that would be wrong. But the reason I almost made that mistake is that long wavelength light has low energy, and short wavelength light has high energy. Now, I was kind of thinking about energy instead of wavelength, so I almost made that mistake every time I gave this lecture. But I think it's useful. And that's one of the cool things about light, is that there is a one-to-one correspondence between wavelength and energy. If you know the wavelength of some light, you know that light's energy too. Guaranteed. You can say the same thing about frequency. Long wavelength for light means low frequency, and short wavelength means high frequency. Wavelength and frequency, in case you don't know, are properties of a wave. This is like a long wavelength, and that's short wavelength, the difference between the crests. And then frequency is how fast it moves from wavelength to wavelength. So, yeah. So, again, just like with wavelength and energy, there's also a one-to-one between wavelength and frequency. If you know the wavelength, you know the frequency, and vice versa. And so by extension, you can also say if you know the frequency, you know the energy. It's one of light's more useful qualities. So, but, I say this, but this is not all the kind of light that there is. There's actually quite a lot more light. We just can't see it. Our eyes are sensitive to these colors, but there are many, many more colors which we can't perceive. We just don't have the hardware to do it. And that is the full EM spectrum, which I'm going to get into now. I'm going to use this same scale of long wavelength over here and short wavelength over here. I'm going to draw it down here. So, here's the EM spectrum. The longest wavelength you have radio. Then you've got microwave. Then right under visible light, you have infrared. Then you have visible. Then right above visible is ultraviolet. violet. Then you have X-rays and gamma rays. So yeah, again, long wavelength, low energy, short wavelength, high energy. So, I think that about does it for color. But we're going to be talking about something else. So, the next question, I believe, is what is spectra?